anciently evolved native Australian species, which I, of course, very much agree with, especially being a wildlife ecologist and conservationist, and having fought for endangered species such as the
reserve design that we could try here.
Yeah, well, I mentioned those log and pole fences. They call them buck rail also in some places, different names. But there's a picture in my recent article that came out in the Horse Talk magazine of them. And it is very, very effective, and it's semi-permeable. It allows other animals to, it allows other animals to pass through the fence, such as deer and rabbits and foxes.
Yeah, well, that's really important, because a lot of the exclusion plots that are being constructed here to keep the Brumbies out of sensitive areas exclude everything out of those areas.
Yeah, so they're lacking all the herbivores. Yeah, and I think in general, I think there needs to be a more bending, you might say, flexible approach to conservation in Australia. That will recognize that in the Australian empire, we should really, in light of the tremendous changes that are occurring to the Earth now, such as global heating or warming, and that's very serious. And so I think it's of preeminent importance to establish a well-functioning ecosystem that supports life in all the different elements that are necessary to life, including the producer plants, the consumer animals, and the recycling decomposers. Each one is absolutely vital for the continuation of life.
Yeah, well, I hope that answers the question that you sent in, Joanne.
Yeah, there are places that have employed quite a bit of reserve design here in the United States, and I've contributed to certain of those areas, like for example, here in the Pine Nuts, just east of where I live, and the Clan Alpine Range, which is a little further into the interior of Nevada. And they've tried Montgomery Pass down to the south on the Nevada California border in the Inyo National Forest. Are incorporate quite a few elements of reserve design. Naturally, some do predate to quite a degree, but it is self-stabilizing population, so it shows it can be done.
Exactly.
Craig, I've got one question that's come through about the reserve design, and that is, do wild horses actually dig for water as do other creatures?
Yeah, burros do. And now you have Dr. Eric Lundgren, who was here at the Arizona State University in Tempe, and I've corresponded with him. He's done some really fine work showing how burros dig wells, and how that causes the plant and animal community to flourish there in the very hot Sonoran Desert in Arizona. And now I'm glad to see he's there with the Center for Compassionate Conservation at the Sydney Technical University. But I've observed that in horses all my life. I've observed how they also dig wells and help other plants and animals in their ecosystems.
So Craig, you've actually spent some time in Australia, have you not? One of the questions that's come up, I think, is, your familiarity with our fragile ecosystem. And what are your thoughts about our alleged fragile ecosystem?
Well, I think it's very important to protect fragile ecosystems, but I think at the same time, it's very important to recognize the positive benefits that horses can contribute. And one thing is they're very mobile animals, and they're always on the move. They're not, as contrasted with cattle, they are not camping a lot. They're more sedentary animals, whereas the horses are quite mobile. They tend to be semi-nomadic even. They have very large, particularly in sparser vegetated and drier areas. They move out and establish very large home ranges. But we shouldn't just, arbitrarily brand them as being misfits, because they're highly adaptable animals, and they've co-evolved a lot with us people, actually. I mean, where would we be without the horses,
No.
And that's why I brought in the fact, the aspect of the moral issue here too, for all they've done. I think that's a very important one that we should not neglect. And their aesthetic qualities is very nice. But aside from that, as an ecologist, I've seen that they consistently contribute positively to ecosystems in many different ways. And one of the things is that they have a different digestive system. All the parasitodactyls, which are my specialty, the tapirs, the rhinos, and the horses, have a different digestive system, and so do certain other animals, herbivores in particular, but it's called the monogastric, postgastric digesting, cecal digestive system. And that entails that the food they consume can be coarser and drier, and it doesn't burn up their metabolism, as is the case with many ruminants who must, with their multi-stomach pregastric, very thorough digestive system, must thoroughly decompose what they eat. Now, the horses, the burros, the tapirs, the rhinos, they do have a fermentated process that goes on in particularly in the horses, it's a very large organ, the cecum. It's the largest, I believe, in the whole animal kingdom for any of the animals that have that cecum. And our appendix is a vestige of the cecum. But the point is that their droppings, which they produce, great boon to the ecosystem. I mean, they produce tons of natural fertilizer, which is not very degraded. In other words, it still has it's organically intact, much so than that of deer, sheep, and cattle. And so in other words, there's a lot for the microorganisms to work on, to digest, for the little insects to burrow into, for the scarab beetle, the dung beetles to go and roll off into their nests and distribute. And it's really an amazing process. And that bolsters ecosystem in nations where you don't have this negative attitude toward naturally living horses. They're actually using horses and burros and onagers and zebras and different animals. They're members of the horse family. And I guess same could be said about the tapir and the rhino. They're using them to restore ecosystems that have been degraded, overgrazed, or even polluted. And so consequently, what I'm saying is that these brumbies are enhancing the ecosystem, and they could be actually benefiting many of the native Australian, the more deeply rooted native Australians. So you would have kind of like a new readjustment of the order, but that would preserve a lot of the same native species. I think that ecologists and land manager, nature reserve, and there was this apparently wrote so many changes, and the life community is having to readjust. So people should not be so rigid, narrow-minded. We should give the benefit of the doubt and see where species can fit in. And I believe we should do this for the Brumby.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Craig, I mean, you've actually led me into one of the next questions after you describing what, you know, some of the significant benefits of having Brumbies in our landscape can do. And one question that I think needs addressing, because it hasn't been here at all, is that here in Victoria, I mean, we are being faced with an eradication plan. It's not a reduction plan, it's an eradication plan that is happening here in Victoria.
So I've heard.
And removing such a large species out of the environment as a snap grab away, I mean, what outcomes are there going to be for the environment when such a significant contributor has just been ripped out of it?
I think we should take a very close look at that, because, well, the European colonists came with the first fleet in 1788. They've been here about 2.5 centuries. A lot can happen in 2.5 centuries. A lot of boo I'm particularly concerned with, and it's quite smoky here now, here with these California and West Coast fires, is that when you take those away, you're going to take away a great mitigating or even prevention agent for catastrophic wildfires. And, you know, if the whole place burns up, then who gains anything? You know, if you got your way, but then the ecosystem burns up. And I understand that much of Kosciuszko and neighboring areas burned back in 2003. Like, as I recall, I was told that 71% burned, and that caused a great reduction in many of the wildlife species, the koalas and the wombats and the wallabies and the birds that depend on the tree. Many of the trees, like the mountain ashes, burned up. They're quite valued. And so now does this relate to the question from Meretti?
Meret?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, so I had prepared an answer for that.
Great.
If you'd like to hear it.
I certainly do. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so do you agree with claims that Brumbies in the alpine areas of New South Wales and Victoria are destroying both habitat and wildlife? No, I don't agree. These claims are often based on hyperbole, exaggeration, skewing of observations and data to target the Brumbies. I found that evidence that certain of those officials in power are out. They seem to be out to really discredit with the goal of eliminating the Brumbies. And they have, in my opinion, they've lost their moral compass on this issue. Case in point is the gross overestimation of the population numbers in the Kosciuszko National Park, which I just wrote an article on that, and I had input from a equine scientist who's been following that issue quite professionally, you know. And it's you can Google. It's called see, Justice Sought for Equine Scapegoats. That should get the article, but it presents the earlier counts and population estimates that had been done, and the earlier annual rates of increase, which averaged about 11.5%, maximum 17%. They went 8 to 17 or 7. But anyway, the point is that this new study using the distance method and through the University of St. Andrews, is it, in Scotland, oversaw that. It just didn't jive. I mean, they come up with about 40% annual increase. And then we point out that they're not reducing the ones that removed annually too. And then I pointed out that if you make a blanketing estimate that doesn't consider habitat differences, you can also end up in a greatly exaggerated number, because certain of those habitats might not be quite have the forage or be suitable for sustaining the horses. And that's why I bring in, it's really important to judge what the productivity of the land is, and to make a good solid estimate of the carrying capacity of the habitat. And that can be a very detailed process, especially when there's a lot of variation within an ecosystem. But if you go in with a simple little formula and just say, okay, the density is such, and I'm just going to blanket it in over a huge area, you can get quite an overestimate. And I suspect that's what's happened. So I thought I'd mention that. And now I'll continue that. I believe that officials can overlook the many beneficial mutualisms horses provide for other species, including deep-rooted Australian natives. Many of these are the consequence of their different digestive systems. Well, I already explained that. They contribute more humus to the soils, more intact seeds, and of a greater variety. And that's not just weeds, that's also native species that have been here for millions of years. And another thing is, when you allow natural succession to take place in a degraded habitat, often what's called the weed species are actually just preludes to the more long-term, deeply evolved natives that do restore themselves. So let's be thankful there are some species that can recover severely graded areas, and call them weeds or whatever they are. They're better than nothing. I've learned that a lot too in my career as an ecologist. Anyway, I think this is major. I think they're building the soils, and they're contributing relatively more as compared with ruminants. Intact seeds that go on to successful germination, and they provide the fertile germinating beds because by the end of their species. I think that's really major and should not be overlooked if you're truly objective. And I also want to point out that if they're producing richer, more humus-rich soils, they're contributing to elevating the water table or the aquifer in the area. Since it augments the living sponge effect of the soils. That's a term I used a lot in the Andes when trying to save trying to save the endangered mountain or Andean tapir. We called it the La Esponja Viviente. And that really catches on, because people can imagine a living sponge up in the mountain. They can imagine how gravity, how it absorbs the water when it rains, and then over all seasons of the year, the dry season, it just gradually releases and keeps the water flowing, those streams, keeps it flowing down to the lakes. Extremely important consideration, especially when you've seen mountains that turn to desolate bedrock, pretty much wastelands because of not being respected. So I just say this is bound to result in great advantage for many species, including native ones, because the ecosystem is being enhanced. It's being enhanced. There needs to be more finesse shown in recognizing how the horses can fit in positively, including with more ancient native species, and in recognizing how they have become naturalized over the past 2.5 centuries, and that suddenly jerking them out of the ecosystem would produce many harmful effects for the whole community, including native species that have become dependent upon them A serious, open-minded, and objective, independent investigation of this aspect needs to be done, and I am glad to hear that Dr. Berman of Australia, David Berman, right, of Australia, I guess he's listening. That's great. I hope that he agrees with some of my points, that he is proceeding, and I hope that others are as well.
Yeah. Marilyn, do you have any questions there that have come through that you'd like to
There is
put
one
forward?
question. There was one significant question I felt that putting to one side the clear benefit of horses, what if there is a large overabundance of horses? How?
Well, that's the beauty of reserve design, is that
Okay.
when you establish, when you design a reserve to be bounded, where there are certain barriers, often it involves incorporating natural barriers, which is the smart way to do, like really high mountains or rushing rivers that they can't go across, or if necessary, these log and pole fences or other similar barriers, that don't overly disrupt the ecosystem. Well, the horse is a climax species. That's one of the first things I learned, along with others. It's a species that tends to level off and to adjust to its ecosystem as it occupies an area over the generations. It's a member of the relatively permanent successional sphere or stage, which is most stable. It's not like a real primitive pioneer stage. It can be a member of the permanent community because, well, it's a major species, it has major effects. And I just ask you this: if they were like like we used to think of the lemmings, just being totally wild, or the rabbits just totally wild and would never stop reproducing, I think that's a fiction that suits their negative view, branding of the horse. Actually, the horse has many ways of limiting its population when it fills its niche in an ecosystem. It levels off reproduction, and key to this are the mature social units. The harem, family harem structure we call bands out here. Those mature stallions and mares, they inhibit the reproduction in the younger horses. So it's very important to allow those mature social units to remain, and they can be key to stabilizing the population. Also, as I was saying before, when the horses fill their niche, they tend to level off on their reproduction, actually do not reproduce as much. And they do that naturally, instinctively. And I'll get back to my point. These are ancient species here. If they were such unstable, wild reproducers, I don't think they would have made it all these millions of years. They would have crashed long ago, because that's what happens to, erratic species. They can crash, and or they belong in the pioneer stage, but not in the climax stage of the community.
There is one other question, if I may. Am I on unmute? I hope I am.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, good. Yeah. And it's come through from Joanne. During the time you spent in Australia, did you observe any negative impact on water quality at all caused by wild Brumbies?
Well, I was taken up into the Snowy River by Rob Gibbs. I really appreciated that tour, as well as others there with the Snowy Mountain Equestrian Association. Lisa Caldwell and her husband, and May Lee's son also accompanied me, and Mark Carroll is a photojournalist. And most of that park, those highlands, including in Kosciuszko, where I was taken in by MP Peter Cochrane on horseback to observe them. Well, most of the habitat seemed fine. There were certain areas, though, particularly that Rob Gibbs showed me, took us way up on top of the plateau, and we saw certain marshlands in highland meadows, and there were certain impacted areas But you know, most of the habitats were fine. They were intact. There were certain areas where they'd come in to drink, or they have the habit of wallowing. Many animals have that. Now, if you go to Africa and you have zebras and wildebeest and oryx and gazelle and everything, they also do the same, and they certainly have impacts around the places where they water or congregate socially. But I didn't believe it was the extreme alarming impact that I believe it's being over magnified and used as an excuse against them to try and justify their elimination. And I think that if there are certain areas like that, then like in that one area where Rob took us, I think a fence around that area would be justified, like a log and pole to let it recuperate, but still provide water to them. And that's often done here in Nevada too. In the herd management areas, we fence off the headwaters of the springs, but we always provide a little trough and a little pipe down to a trough so the wildlife and the wild horses can drink.
Right. Is there any more questions there, Marilyn, or can
No,
I get on to some more?
Yeah, I think some of the questions that we've got coming up are probably going to address
Yeah.
some of those that are popping up now.
Absolutely, great. Okay, we have a question from Helen. Why do you think this area of research is so underfunded and seemingly ignored by the scientific community, Craig?
Okay, this relates to the deliberate, in my opinion, the deliberate ongoing targeting by established interests, certain established interests, because I've met a lot of the established interests that like the Brumbies there in Australia, who use the naturally living horses as convenient scapegoats to blame for ecological problems that certain other factors of society are actually causing, and certain other traditions that we conveniently overlook, such as vehicles or even hiking or other species that could be in fact causing much more damage, such as rabbits or deer or red foxes or just certain things that are imbalanced there, roadways, for example. In many cases, I think that in many cases, in fact, the horses would greatly help overcome these very problems, such as certain eroded areas if they build the soils, or otherwise bolster certain productivity in the plants. That's been proven too. They can actually increase the productivity of plants by munching down certain parts. Remember, they have upper and lower incisors. And so they can carefully nip and select and prune the vegetation, whereas most of the ruminants don't. They just have a hard palate and they often rip it up by the roots. And another thing is they're not cloven hoofed. The cloven hoofed animals, the deer, cattle, and sheep, can really cut deeply into the soil. They go into a meadow area, and I think that meadow or other similar ones that Rob showed me, I mean, we should see if it's really the horses, because the horses have a rounded, blunt hoof that doesn't nearly as, carve in or slice into a moist meadow or riparian stream bank habitat. So just, and by the same token, they can very neatly plant a seed with that blunt hoof, and that's been proven too, something I've observed in my studies. So basically, I think that by providing a better balance versus the cloven hoof ruminants, they could actually help the ecosystem, bolster the ecosystem. And often it's those cloven hoof ones, the cattle, deer, and sheep, which are foisted upon the ecosystem in unnatural and overwhelming numbers, just so they can be harvested and taken out, mind you, their bodies taken out, thus preventing their recycling their remains through the natural ecosystem. Now the Brumbies out there are being born, living out their lives and dying and recycling their remains. So they're truly an integral part of the ecosystem. Whereas the hunted animal is removed, and so is the domesticated animal. So that's actually a robbery of the nutrients in the ecosystem, and similar to loggers who remove trees rather than let them decompose.
Yeah.
Decomposition is very important.
Craig, can I just get you back onto the question?
Right.
Why do you think the research is so underfunded?
For the Brumbies?
Yeah.
Well, I think that people are recalcitrant to admit that they were unfair, and you know, it's like they lack the humility to say, hey, wait a minute, you know, I admit that we were not fair here, and so it's a moral question. I think it is, and it requires courage. And I realize that when you're part of a bureaucracy or a group, or you like to be popular, like to fit in. But if you really care about the subject, about what's going on, well, then you're willing to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, you know, let's be reasonable, with all due respect, of course, not in a belligerent or antagonistic way. And let's stay objective, not subjective. Right.
Yeah, because that's certainly an area that the greater public here in Australia are being bombarded with, are all the negatives. And, you know, we do want to get word out that there are many positive reasons why the Brumbies, all the wild horses in any country, should be able to stay in their landscape. So
yeah, and in my analysis, I observed there's a few countries that seem to have this negative or biased view. They're all three English-speaking countries. The three that really stand out here, like a sore thumbs, are Australia, the United States, and Canada. But even England is a lot more positive toward the horses. They're using them. Throughout Europe, they're being used to restore ecosystem. Argentina is using them to restore sheep overgrazed ecosystems.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually in Argentina or Spain where they're actually having rehabilitated domestic horses put back out into the wild to try and...
Yeah, they're in the Donata Reserve. I looked that up since we spoke about that yesterday, and they're called the Rituerta horses, and they're in Andalusia.
Right.
And they are helping to restore the oak. But one of the main primitive strains of horse was the Iberian horse there, and there's quite a few remnants of that here among the Mustangs. We call them Spanish Mustangs. They have the thick necks, and they're quite different from the Arabians or the Tarpans. You know, they're definitely very, very primitive, very distinct, and very strong. Really, a real surviving horse. You know, real survivor.
Yeah. And she would like to know, are there any groups of advocates, either in the United States or Australia, that you can name that are doing a particularly good job of lobbying the case for keeping wild horses here in Australia?
Yeah. Well, I think you have some good groups there in Australia. I think the Snowy River Horsemen's Association there out of Jindabyne.
Yep.
I think they're very effective, and your Brumby Action Group, and the Barma Hay Angels. Yeah. And there were just so many. I met Libby Lovegrove out of the Kimberley horse, and she's a very educated lady, and she agreed. She said those Brumbies out there in the Kimberley and in the Bankside Brumbies were doing all the things I said. They were replenishing the plants, increasing the productivity, and that many of the native species agreed very well, coexisted very harmoniously with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're in Australia. I was really impressed with the interest, and I think these people should be treated with respect and not just turned a deaf ear to. And many of them are some of the old pioneer families, you know, that are quite established. And here in the United States, I think those who have really stood up for the purity of the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act and have fought the good fight, so to speak, are Protect Mustangs out of Berkeley, that I've worked a lot with, and the International Society for the Protection of Mustangs and Burros, which was the original group that Velma Braun Johnston or Wild Horse Annie established, and it's still fighting the good fight. And also Friends of Animals have gone to court to maintain the integrity so that the wild horses don't become just semi-domesticated animals out there that are just token. And they fought for that. And also there's a new group called the Wild Horse Fire Abatement and Prevention Brigade, but they call it a brigade. And he's fighting hard because this Captain Bill up there in Northern California, Simpson, he has about 1,000 acres and he runs like about 70 horses there, you know, pretty wild. And during the Clamathon the other year, 2018, that started just to the west, it swept around but it didn't take his place because he had the horses there and they were munching down the dry tinder and they were keeping the juniper trees limbed also. And that ironic, I mean, by coincidence, I don't know, or anyway, a great value of that was that it prevented that Klamathon from sweeping into the Siskiyou Klamath National Monument, which is a really precious place for preserving nature and old indigenous ruins and whatnot. It actually, having that space there prevented that Klamathon fire from going in there. So I think he's standing up for a lot of good things, and he's also done a number of articles, and he's quantitatively assessed too the amounts of manure that typical horse produces and how that relates to soil enrichment. And that's very true. And that's something I learned a lot at Berkeley, because I used to go over quite a bit to the San Francisco Botanical Garden in the Golden Gate Park across the bay, and learned there that in the 1870s, they started that park by enriching its soils from sandy, not very rich soil that's right near the Pacific Ocean there, by mixing it with horse manure, which they had a lot more horses back then, of course. And to this day, they still use horse manure, and they have Australia and the Andes, and they have South African plants from all over the world there that really, really
well, I
do
guess
well.
there's a reason why a lot of farms and studs and just small horse owners put their bags up at the front of their driveway and sell their collected horse poo, because it really is good for the soil. Yeah. People pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And many of those so-called peasants, you know, the campesinos that I worked with in the Andes, they very much recognize that the value of the horse manure.
Yeah. Marilyn, do you want me to continue with the question?
Well, I did have, there was a question that's come through from Lisa Ryan, which really it's a post-fire question. Lisa's asking, what is your view, Craig, on some level of contraception while landscapes recover, noting Australia's recent bushfires and the impact to sustainable and healthy Brumby populations?
Well, I'm concerned about the PZP because it has a number of very adverse effects. One of the worst, the most fatal, is that over the generations, it weakens the immune systems of the horses. And another thing I'd like to point out is that the horses can help a burned ecosystem regenerate by reestablishing their soil, the humus content, and by seeding many plants, including
Well,
the
that's
deeply rooted natives.
that's really relevant, Craig, because that's actually one of the arguments that is raised by those that would like to remove Brumbies, is that post wildfires, with so much damage to the native habitat, that Brumbies have to be removed to allow recovery. And yet you are telling us now you have a different position.
No, I think they could be a major restorative species or factor there for recovering the ecosystem. But of course, I think everything should be subject to some examination. To don't just take it from me. But that is the case in many areas, that they do help regenerate ecosystems that have been degraded, because they build soils, they contribute humus, and they seed more plants because of that difference of their digestive system. So if they need to be certainly maybe controlled a little bit, then maybe certain fences could be employed, so that if they tend to be concentrating too much in one area. But nonetheless, I don't think they should just be branded as a negative for those ecosystems.
Yeah, and one of the other questions that's come through is, does the benefits of horses vary with their density? Is there an ideal density in relation to carrying capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. However, how are we going to determine the carrying capacity? You usually do that by observing nature and what it will support. You know, if you come in with a very kind of narrowly focused, narrowly based criteria for establishing a carrying capacity, it might be a false carrying capacity. So I think the beauty of reserve design is it shows respect for nature, and it learns from nature, rather than say, well, we believe that these species should be predominant and not those others, rather than let nature inform us about the more harmonious, well-functioning balance.
Yeah.
That's part of the issue, though, in Australia, I think, is that those who wish to remove the Brumbies want to return to some impossible ecology that maybe existed 500 years ago. We cannot, I believe. What's your thought on that, Craig? How can we get back?
Well, yeah, I read the whole book by Bruce Pierce, I believe is his name, on the new ecology or something, about how altered so many ecosystems on the earth. I think any well-educated, curious person today will admit, that humanity is so altered the natural world, and the idea of going back to the pristine pre-civilization ecosystem is really not very realistic. It's kind of a pipe dream, actually. Or it might be used to promote certain, for example, they might single out one, like the Brumby or the wild horse, but overlook all the others. And that's why I think it's really important that we think about well-functioning ecosystems. At the same time, try and preserve as much as we can all the different species, because I'm for that, but it's gone so far now. And the other point is that ecosystems have always been evolving. There's been always major changes on the earth. I mean, going from one age to the other, one epoch to the other, there's been really wholesale revamping of the cast of species characters on the earth. And certainly what man has caused, right now it's called the sixth great extinction, what we're causing, which could be the very most dire. And there's been some incredibly dire extinctions on the earth, but our species is threatening to create a sterile planet here, because if the planet warms and becomes a baking oven, then I don't know if any life will survive on this planet. I mean, that's a real scare, and that's something that should wake everyone up who's at all concerned or identified with the greater community of life. So my point is that horses are an ancient species here. They've done tremendous amount for mankind. They've been our friends and companions, yet they're highly adaptable, and their greater place is in the world of nature. And they've proven that in so many areas where they've let them go, they've been able to adapt, like Sable Island off the coast of northeast Canada, pretty harsh environment, or down in the deep south, you know, the Choctaw ponies, or out here in the arid deserts of my state of Nevada, or take, for example, the Namibian desert down in South Africa, where those Arabians were let go, and they assigned a PhD student, Grayling, to do his study. He came in with the idea that he was going to find all kinds of negative things about these to justify their removal. What he found was that they were enhancing the ecosystem for the very reasons I was talking about. And they got along famously with the endangered oryx and the ostriches. And they had an incredible diversity of endemic plants there. And they did not, the wild Namibian horses did not negatively impact those plants. So it was just the opposite. It was similar. So my point is, I think it could be a very similar situation in areas here in Australia, whether it's in the dry outback, or whether, you know, it's up in the Australian Alps. But if there are, I mean, I don't want to act like I'm just a closed mind person as far as preserving really pristine examples where there's, you know, very intact ancient ecosystems. I'm for preserving those, but I don't want it to be, you know, what they call a monkey trial, you know, where it's a predetermined conclusion that the Brumbies are misfits. I want to see really objective, solid, honorable science conducted by and independent checks, not a railroading of the conclusion. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else there, Marilyn, that comes into this question?
Well, there was something here, and I'm not sure, Craig, whether, I mean, we've got a question coming up, I think, about the reserve design and PZP. So maybe we'll ask this might fit more suitably in a moment.
Okay.
And there's another question I've come through about how many Australian species of mammals have become extinct during the last 200 years, and whether or not horses may have contributed to those extinctions. I think there is a claim in certain scientific circles that Brumbies have contributed to the demise of a particular breed of frog, if I'm correct there, Renee. Is that correct?
Oh, the Corroboree?
Yeah, the Corroboree.
Yeah,
So
that was up there.
What are your thoughts about that?
Part, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was there in where we camped out and went in with Peter Cochran to see the Brumbies. And there were Corroboree frogs there nesting. And I saw them, and I saw their little enclaves where they produced near the streams. Most of the streams were fine there. They had good banks, and there were a few where the horses would come in to habitually drink that were impacted, but I didn't notice a blanketing impact upon the habitat. I noticed certain localized impacts. So I think, again, I think the approach should be fair-minded, and we should always take into consideration the scale of our evaluation, because if we are over-magnifying certain little snapshots and then saying, oh, look what they did, you know, by association, rather than taking a real quantitative habitat approach with a grid, an extensive grid, then, you know, then it would be unfair. So I just believe that there needs to be an independent check, and I'm glad that
Again,
Dr.
yeah.
Berman is looking into this, and I think that others should too. And I would hope that the park officials and biologists would likewise collaborate with that.
I think that
Just
also
on that
leads,
corroboree frog.
Mm.
I was
Yeah,
just
go
going to
ahead.
say, just getting back to the corroboree frog, the biggest threat to that frog is actually the fungus that's killing them.
The chytrid fungus, yeah,
Yeah.
that's all over the world, in the Andes too, which has incredible amphibian diversity. It's so tragic how many are declining and even going extinct. Those little colorful frogs that I got to know, and salamanders.
So there is one other question that's come through that apparently may have been part of an earlier question that was posted privately, but I just want to pop it in here, and it does relate to damage. So this is from Trish. Many anti-Brumby people argue, who are anti the Brumbies remaining in the parks, claim the Australian ecosystem is millions of years old and unique to Australia. So what applies elsewhere in the world does not apply here. And here the Brumbies are damaging, if not destroying, Australia's fragile ecosystems. Does that make, is that?
Well, again, I believe that's a conclusion I think is too drastic. For the reasons I said before, if they are contributing positively to soils and to humus and to seed dispersal and germination on a greater scale, then they could actually be benefiting many plants and animals that are deeply rooted natives, and that should be examined as a logical hypothesis to test. And it could be very similar to the case in Namibia, where they went in with a lot of them went in and just, oh yeah, the piece of cake, he's going to discredit him and we're going to go out and shoot him or round him up. But he proved all the opposite. He proved they were helping the ecosystem. So, and I know there's a lot of different eco types, biomes in Australia, and that each area has to be specially considered. For example, I wouldn't recommend them for the Queensland tropical rainforests or certain very sensitive habitats. But now there is a study by Danish equine biologists and ecologists that was published, Northrop and Spinning, and which shows that much of Australia is suitable. They analyzed worldwide the habitats, and they showed that much of Australia is a suitable climate and vegetation-wise habitat for the survival of horses. And they recommended as an important species to reintroduce, to reestablish the meso and the mega herbivores who went largely extinct, not only in Australia, but in many places of the world, and that they're actually coming back in and restoring those niches, which are very important to the nutrient cycling and the well functioning of the ecosystem. And this is a major consideration that many of my colleagues agree with, that they're needed. They might also see soil building, and that relates to fire, catastrophic fire prevention, also prey animals, type of prey animal.
Yeah. I'll just go on to a question from John. We've actually already answered the first part of John's question previously. Thanks, Craig, in regards to what sort of area would be needed for wild horses to be sustainable in, and you've covered that one. Thank you. But the next part of John's question is, can you suggest how non-academic credentialed people can actually make an impact on the thoughts, attitudes, and the ultimate decision-making processes regarding conservation, especially with regards to principles of compassionate conservation?
Okay, yeah, that was one I was working on just not long ago. Yes, first, I think it's very important these people educate themselves on the evolution, ecology, behavior, history with people, except judges, of their requirements for long-term survival and better able to effectively counter and disprove the bias attitudes and conclusions or preemptory conclusions against the wild horses. So many of which are based on blind adherence to traditions, regardless how destructive such may be. One should strive to become an effective public speaker and writer, as well as to have to hone one's observational skills and become a bit of a detective who sees beyond the quote big show and bravado of the wild horse enemies. Finally, I cannot overstress the value of having the courage of one's convictions to stand up in defense of the wild horses, whether at public meetings, court proceedings, or just in everyday conversations. Don't back down when you know and appreciate these animals and their positive effects in our shared home world more than their detractors do. So a little bit of gumption here, a little bit of courage.
That's
is
remarkable, very inspiring. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Thank you.
I think we can all draw from that amazing movie, The Power of One.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, can make a difference for sure. Okay, getting on to the last set of questions that we've got here, Craig, and this comes from Barbara. Why do you believe the reserve design is the best answer to keep horses wild living?
Okay, reserve design is most respectful of nature, both of horse kind and of the natural life community or ecosystem. It is based on we humans learning from horses in the natural world, out of which they arose and to which they return very quickly as their age-old instincts revive. Reserve design involves our discovering the best for most harmonious way to coexist with naturally living horses, but of necessity, we humans will have to make sacrifices and changes if we want to realize a truly benign way of life that shares the land and freedom to any significant degree with the horses. We will have to relinquish our narrow-minded, tunnel vision, dictatorial ways concerning what species do or do not belong, and give up being so selfish as give up being so selfish as in it's all for us humans alone and none of the other species really matter. And if we're going to have a wild horse containing ecosystem, obviously there has to be some adjustments. But just to go in and say, oh, you know, these are the misfits, but well, wink, wink on all our deer, which we hunt, or all our livestock, you know, we all got to compromise on all sides. So that's how, if you're going to be an egotist, then how is anything positive going to happen? You know, who's perfect anyway? And I happen to identify with the horses. I grew up on a horse. I observe the natural horses a lot out here, and I'm quite identified with them. They're like part of my life and identity. And when I see them just callously, you know, spoken about and all kinds of negative things, like, and when I get into societies, well, okay, the big N is being negative toward wild horses. Well, that just doesn't set well with me. I mean, they used to say, well, Craig, you must be a reincarnated Indian because he sure got different values than us people here. But, well, yeah, the Indians were here for thousands of years. And maybe I am culturally identified with them, but I just think it's right. It's right to live respectfully and to have a more natural, freedom-loving and freedom-respecting way of life, and to honor all the other species, including such a magnificent species as the horse. They used to call them they still do call them, of course, the Wonkatonkan, like the great dog or something. That's, they had myths about him, and so did many people all over the world. I just think they're like part of the soul of the world, and to reduce them just to so many ciphers, mere ciphers, mere things in the way at our convenience. I just think that's wrong, and that's why I was always for Wild Horse Annie and the Wild Horse Act, and letting him have a life, learning to share the land in freedom with him. That was just right up my alley since I was a boy, and I remain that way. So if you say I'm immature, then so be it. And
don't change, Craig.
Thanks.
Yeah. Just to follow on from Barbara's question too, from the reserve design, you believe strongly that that's preferable to using PZP, and that's why?
Yeah, let's see. I'll get to that part because that was that the very last question?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is, Craig.
Do you believe reserve design is preferable to using PZP?
Yeah.
If so, why? Yes, reserve design is immensely preferable to using PZP to control the wild horse population. PZP produces a number of very harmful and long-lasting effects upon the horses. It disrupts their social cohesiveness, particularly of the family-centered bands, but also, and consequently, of the entire interconnected herds to which the bands belong. PZP undermines the natural vigor and liveliness of the horses. I see this a lot here where they've been PZP'd. Makes them miserable and dissatisfied, and contrary to its purpose of limiting population growth, it destabilizes the mature social structures by the mature stallions and mares who actually inhibit and decrease reproduction in younger horses, which they usually train in the ways of survival. But this training is also disrupted by PZP because the social unit is broken up and the mares are dissatisfied. They reject the stallions who cannot impregnate them. They go on to others. The cohesiveness of the band is broken up, and I've seen these miserable horses in many places. So we see PZP is a major blow to the overall fitness and natural acumen of ongoing generations of wild horses. Also, over the generations, PZP application results in a serious weakening of the immune system of the wild horses because the mares upon whom it works the best, that is, best prevents pregnancies, are precisely those with the strongest immune systems, while those mares with the weakest immune system are least affected by PZP and produce the most, thus perpetuating weaker and weaker immune systems in future generations, and setting the wild horse population up for massive die-out as produced by disease, natural catastrophes, including fires, drought, etc. I refer you to my article on the subject, Why PZP and Wild Horses Do Not Belong Together. And also has been noted out-of-season births with PZP, when those who come off of it have out-of-season births. They can die in the middle of the winter. Often the foals are deformed or stillborn.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, on that
Friends
part
of
of
Animals hired some very professional people, and they did some remarkable work amassing a lot of this information too, including biologists and different investigators, Friends of Animals there in the United States.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, the big buck question and the big moral ethical question is, how do we deal with these some areas that may be overpopulated around the world?
Well, you know, in nature, things aren't always so clean as we like them to be. I mean, there is death, you know, and there's suffering. But someone put online some contrasts, you know, recently, the other day, and it showed, okay, here's a place where men prevail in the ecosystem. Here's another place where the plants and animals prevail, and man's presence is relatively minor. In almost every case, I mean, the place where they had allowed nature to take its course and was reestablish a balance, was a beautiful place, had clean air, clean water, had a great variety of plants and animals. Whereas the place where they had let man have his way, almost, you know, to a greater degree, was kind of a miserable place. You know, the water was dirty, was full of mud and toxin, and the air was full of smoke and pollution. So, you know, I just think, I think the one who has to change and to act more reasonably are us people, and that we owe respect to all the species here, including the horse. My gosh, if we don't have respect for the horse, then who would we respect? And I, you know, I've never been a person that likes to treat any form of life as a mere object for humans' convenience. I think we have to get back to the old reverent, you know, the animistic or reverence for life attitudes, like so many of the great cultures and religions had and practiced too, you know, including the Native American, the Aborigines, imagine, and you know, certainly many of the Asian people, the Buddhists and Hindus and those kind of people.
There is one question I wouldn't mind asking. Now, we're talking about overpopulation, and I think it is, and I'm thinking now, post the massive wildfires we had in 2019 in the Australian Alps, which affected New South Wales and Victoria, could that be, I mean, there are many who argue that our wildfires are caused by climate damage or climate change, but we've actually had an event of such a nature where it's even been believed if the 2003 bushfires reduced Brumby populations by 41%, goodness knows what the reduction might have been.
I thought it was 53%.
I believe one report, I'm not sure about the 2019 wildfires, but the 2003 bushfires, I've read a report that said 40 reduced Brumby populations by 41%. So we don't, because there has been no Brumby count taken since the wildfires, I'm just wondering where that's going to leave our Brumby populations, particularly New South Wales.
I mean, if that recent study said there were 15,708 Brumbies in all of the Kosciuszko, whereas the more traditional studies that date back to, you know, years, showed only about a fourth that number, you know, 5,000 or so. Then, yeah, then if they have over-exaggerated using this computer program, then they will wipe them all out, you know. Probably come up short. They'll come up short. And then if the Brumbies are jerked out of that habitat where they've been for quite a while, then many of those codependent species, including many of the natives that have been evolving with them, could be really suffering as well. And then what happens if all that dry biomass builds up, and then you have another catastrophic wildfire with the global heating that's occurring on the earth today? So, I mean, these are the real urgent questions, I think. And in 2014, that's something I always stressed there to my fellow ecologists at the Ecological Society of Australia annual conference in Alice Springs was, you know, as well as the ones I've been talking about, I also stress fire prevention. And, you know, not one of them disagreed with me on that point. You know, they said, they really scratched their heads on that one. They said, well, I think that's true. And same when I was there in the Australian Alps, you know, no one really countered me on the role of horses in mitigating catastrophic fires.
Okay. Well, in terms of all the questions that have been sent in, that does conclude that part of it.
We do have,
Unless there's
right, we
something
have
there.
got some more questions coming through, and I think we've got extra time. There was one comment that came through. You'd mentioned a book earlier, a publication was Fred Pierce. It was perhaps the book
Fred
Wild.
Pierce, yeah, I was
Yeah,
calling
no,
him Bruce. Yeah, it's Fred Pierce.
okay, yeah, Fred.
Yeah.
Okay, the other question is that's come through is a very good example. Joanne's noted and just suggesting that a good example of what you have been speaking about is Chernobyl. Humans moved out and nature has taken over, and it's actually flourishing. So that's a very good. Yeah.
Right, yeah, and I didn't quite answer the earlier question that Renee posed about, well, what would you do if they're considered to be overpopulated in an area? I just sort of alluded to let, you know, nature take its course, but I realize there's some situations where you do have to step in, particularly if it's a very precarious situation. So that's why I suggested the log and pole fences. And also, but I stand by letting nature establish its balance, because in the short term it might appear, you know, not so clean everything, but once it gets through the bottleneck and the balance is established, it can be really beautiful, very harmonious for a long period of time, and it can react to the current conditions. You know, what people have to realize is that species, whether you call them weeds or aliens or, you know, invasors or whatever, they've all been here on the earth evolving for all these millions of years. And there's been a lot of changes and upheavals. I think it's just remarkable that people can go and totally take a big caterpillar and totally grade off all the topsoil down to the bedrock. And yet these remarkable little organisms will come in, reestablish an ecosystem there. It might take a little while, but I think that's just amazing. You might look like a little wire or something, but I mean, that's the whole point. What I'm trying to say should be the heart and soul of reserve design. Is having respect for all life, you know, and it's all got a reason, kind of a religious connotation, you might say, even. You know.
Is there anything else there, Marilyn?
Well, there is another question that I think is, I think Craig's probably spoken about this in a different way, but another question: most healthy ecosystems have predators that help to suppress population growth. And do you think, Craig, that something else, us, should replace the predators in Australia, since there are not big cats? Well, I think that person has overlooked the Australian dingo to a certain degree.
Yeah, the dingo does. Yeah, I observed them, and they do take the brumbies to quite an extent. So do the saltwater alligators over in the coastal areas, like way up there where what they call it, Namibian, where the Australians near Darwin here. Yeah,
because there were brumbies on Fraser Island. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have a lot of poisonous animals in Australia. You have snakes and spiders. They're some of the most deadly in the world, and they also take a lot. Well, you know, I do recognize that man can be a predator. He can be part of the natural predatory balance. I think there the key word is balance and moderation, not making the species just into like a crop to harvest, you know, and then acing out all the natural predators. I think the key there is the natural part. But I mean, having, to me, I couldn't kill a horse. They just mean too much to me. I would rather have them like removed and rehomed, gentled for people that appreciate the company of horses.
Yeah. Well, we're getting pretty close to our wrap-up time, and I can't believe an hour and a half has gone this quick.
Yeah, it's been great. I think we covered a lot of ground.
Well, I think we've addressed all the questions. So I think we will wrap up now. We just want to thank you again, Craig, for giving us your time today, and for everybody for sending in their excellent questions and attending. And just a reminder to everyone, please stay tuned into Brumby Action Group and Barmer Brumby Hay Angels for petitions, updates on what we're doing. The bill, Victorian Heritage Brumby Bill, will be delayed a little due to the Parliament not sitting regular dates yet, but please keep signing the petition. When it comes time to introduce the bill, the more people that have actually signed that petition will be assigned to MPs who will either support the bill or not. That there is actually hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who want to see Brumbies protected. I mean, we've got well over 150,000 signatures already. Well, let's keep going. Let's get that to 200 and then 300, because I think there are people out there who, Australians, want to preserve wild living Brumbies. So thank you, Craig. Thanks, Renee, for doing such a wonderful job again.
Is that petition just for Australians to sign, or
anybody can sign it?
Good.
Yeah, and it's on the Brumby Action Group page, and also the Barmer Brumby Hay Angels. And that group also is doing a marvellous job in supporting the Brumbies in Barmer Forest. They fundraise to buy hay, and they have been doing that for some years now, a few years. Renee, how many years has that been happening?
Oh, it seems like forever.
Yeah, they're really
but yeah, I mean, you know, that whole group just developed out of a need for the Barmer Brumbies, and we're continually going from strength to strength to stand by what our convictions are. And like you said, Craig, you might be the odd one in the group, but we will keep talking up.
That's right.
Wonderful.
You've been very inspiring.
You'll have more self-respect in the end, you know, if you're true. Not that you're a close-minded person, but that you stick by what you appreciate.
Yeah, well, I dug you out trying to help many years ago, and you've certainly stuck by everything that we've asked of you. And heartfelt thanks, Craig.
Well, thank you so much. I will strive to be more effective, but I really appreciate that. It's been a real privilege and honor. So thank you.
Well, one day we'll meet.
Okay.
We will.
I'd love to come back there.
Sure.
Yeah, wonderful. The webinar has been recorded, and it will be available up on YouTube and on both Facebook groups. So please, everybody, thank you. Thank you for coming and participating.
Bye,
Bye, Craig. Bye. Thanks,
Renee.
Renee. Bye.
Thanks,
See you next time, everybody.
See ya.
Bye. Bye.